now. And we are so excited for our conversation today and to have you all with us. This is our 5th community call, and Openscapes is an initiative to help researchers do better science in less time together. Through our Champions Mentorship Program, we help research teams develop habits for data-intensive science that's more open, reproducible, collaborative, inclusive, and kind. And we use these calls as an opportunity to share the things that Julie and I are learning and our team is learning, and the way that we're working. And so we've been working with Beth, and we're really excited to have this conversation today. So thank you for spending time with us. And just as a general reminder, all of our events abide by our code of conduct, and this is a safe, inclusive, welcoming, and harassment-free experience and community for everybody. If you have any issues today, feel free to let Julie or me know in the chat or by email. So our plan for today is to have a conversation with Beth Duckles, and Julie will introduce Beth in just a minute, and then we'll monitor the chat throughout, and we'll have time for verbal Q&A at the end. And this is a great sized group, and so I hope that we'll have a rich conversation as we get into the second half of this conversation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Julie Lowndes, who's the founder of Openscapes, and we co-direct it together. Julie.
Great. Thanks, Erin, and welcome everybody. We're so excited for you all to be here, and so excited to talk with Beth Duckles. So Dr. Beth Duckles is a research consultant and social scientist, and I have a special connection with Beth because we first met through the Mozilla Open Leaders Program, and I had the honor to be a mentor to Beth as she developed her ideas out of all of her programming that became the Open Post-Academics program, which we'll hear more about as well. But so Beth's focus is that she helps technologists, designers, and scientists gather and use human-centered data, supporting folks who are trying out mixed methods and qualitative skills and want coaching and partnership in conducting and analyzing their research. And as a research consultant, she finds impactful mixed method research strategies and cross-disciplinary approaches to challenging problems that scientists, technologists, and social impact firms face. So she's the founder and co-director of Open Post-Academics, which was formerly called the Althenas, which is an online peer support community for people with a PhD who have left or are considering leaving academia. And in our note stock, we've got some links to some of Beth's work. Beth works with an open ethos, and so much of her work is online, available for you to use and look through her slides and view recordings, even if you're not able to join her synchronously. So that's a little introduction to Beth.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm so delighted, and absolutely. I remember when I got the call that I was going to have Julie as my mentor for the Mozilla program, and I was like, oh, this is so exciting. So it was exciting to get the yes, I got the thing, but it was just as exciting to get to have Julie as my mentor. So I'm delighted to be here, and also really delighted to get to talk to you and everybody here about qualitative research and anywhere else the conversation goes. I love good conversation, so let's do it.
Great. Well, we'll kick off the celebrity interview style thing. We've got some questions prepared, and they're in the doc. You're always welcome to ask questions in the chat or reinforce things in the doc, but we'll have specific time for question and answer at the end as well. But please, this is a really great size group, like Erin said, so please feel free to ask questions as we go too. All right. So our first question for you, Beth, what is qualitative data analysis? What is it used? Where is it used? What is your philosophy? And how do you teach it? Please tell us about it.
Well, so I'll start by saying that I'm a sociologist, and I went to a school where most folks is a PhD, where folks think, oh, that's a quantitative school. So I like to tell that because I think a lot of folks, you know, I do talk a lot about qualitative research these days, but I had to talk to a lot of quantitatively minded folks when I was in graduate school, and to prove to them that I could talk about things in a qualitative mindset. qualitative research is really where we gather and work with data that's primarily textual. It can include things like transcripts, it can be like conversations, it can be things that you find like archival work. It can be field notes. So maybe I went into a field and I learned some things. I know that resonates often with a lot of biologists. And so for the purposes of like the discussion today, and we can certainly talk about other things, but I'll just assume we already have that data, right? And I consider text to be data in some manner. We can also talk about collecting it. That's super fine. I love talking about those topics, but qualitative data analysis is what do you do once you have a bunch of text? What do you do with it? How do you work with it? How do you try to come up with patterns and understandings in it? And so there's a lot of fields that have done this for a long time: anthropology, sociology, history, design, UX. There's a bunch of them that have been working with this kind of data. And they're really, what I like the way I like to approach this is to say, okay, especially for data scientists or folks with a data background, what are you going to need out of this data that you wouldn't find in other data that you have? So if you can figure out the answer to something with quantitative methods, please go do that. That's much cheaper. It's easier. You have a workflow for it. Go do that. But if you can't find the answer to the question through the data sets that you already have, then go to qualitative and let's figure out how can we make the kind of qualitative research that you need, that it can get you at the kind of answers that you have. And one of the great ways to do that is to start with the data you already have. So instead of going and collecting things like doing interviews or things like that, what do we already have? What are the materials that are in front of us that we could look at a little bit more closely? And so what we did with and I know we'll get into this, but with Openscapes is that we looked at the, open agendas and tried to look at them and code them and analyze them for the work for the information and for the questions that we had. I'll also say some of the things that I love about qualitative research is that it can often be surprising that you find things out or you look at it differently. You look at things that you may have looked at before and you see new things in them. I also really love it because it can give you frameworks or themes or directions for future research. So if you're not sure what to do next or what else there is, going back and looking at things a little bit more closely can give you, oh, I see a theme in this area. I see these things that we're talking about. It can really give you a new direction. And again, surprising. That's the best part. I often do this with other clients aside from sort of open science folks, and we always try to look for things that are going to answer the question in different ways or new ways or in qualitatively different ways. So maybe we're like, oh, something's going on here. I'm not sure what it is. We can do much more exploratory research. So we don't necessarily have a clear hypothesis yet, but the qualitative work that you do might lead you to a more clear hypothesis to test in, say, the quantitative data that you have. So I'll give you a good example. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was just going to ask, you use the word code, and I was wondering if you can describe, especially to a more quantitative audience, potentially what that is.
So that is like the number one thing we have to do when we're doing qualitative data analysis, is that qualitative researchers in these fields typically use the word code. When we say code as qualitative researchers, I mean annotate the data instead of code the data, or tag the data, for instance, would be another way to do it. I think I've shared in the document, there's something called Taget, which is one of the free and open source software programs that we use to do. And literally it's about tagging the textual data to be able to see what the patterns are in that textual data. The thing is that it's hard to talk qualitative people out of their word coding, but it doesn't make much sense for folks that are used to, say, coding in R, coding in Python, or things like that. So when I say code in terms of qualitative context, and I'll try to use code /annotate /tag, but when I say that, what I usually mean is we're annotating the text with a word or a phrase or something like that helps us to be able to understand it. So I'll give you an example, like maybe we're going through some text and we want to try to understand people. Let's give a good example. I mean, we'll talk about this later when we talk about the Openscapes things, but one of the things that inductively came out of the research we were doing was that a lot of folks were interested in time, ended up just talking about time, the use of time, the lack of time, information, not having enough time. And so as we started to see this was a pattern in the research, in the data that we were looking at, we ended up going to creating a code that was called time, so that we could look at every time that it was somebody was talking about time. And when we do that, we then pull out all of those quotes from all of the different agendas that we have. It gives us a chance to look at how are they talking about time? Well, they're talking about it in terms of it not having enough of it. Time being a really difficult thing if you're running a lab or a part of a lab group. What do I spend my time on? Where do I give my time in order to be able to learn the things I want to learn to do reproducible research? And so as we did that, we sort of inductively saw, okay, here's a theme or a code that we had. And one of the things that qualitative research can do quite well is to say, okay, we have one theme, which is maybe time, for instance, but maybe some people were talking about in terms of I have a lot of time. I don't know very many scientists that would have that, but let's say there were scientists that were saying, I have tons of time to do all the research I want to do. And then there's other people who maybe don't have time. So maybe I'd split that into two groups where some people are talking about having enough time or not having enough time so that you'd be able to see more of it. So we're essentially annotating the existing text that we have with specific codes that help us understand more about it as we go. Does that make sense? Cool.
Yeah, I think that that's a great summary of qualitative analysis and then digging into the tagging bit of it. I really like also your point about sort of the surprising things that come out, which was definitely something that we really enjoyed, seeing those things emerge from our data and doing some of that sense making.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think another thing that I like to talk about with science-based groups as well is that I think small amounts of qualitative work can make your quantitative work much better. So I'll give you a really good example of this, and they can connect with one another. So I don't know if you've ever tried to unsubscribe to a bunch of things and you unsubscribe to, it's usually MailChimp, and they have this survey that says, so maybe you went online and you signed up for a newsletter and you've got 2 of them because you accidentally signed up twice. And then you go back and you hit unsubscribe and you go to this little thing and it tells you, why are you unsubscribing? And it says, I'll just tell you, I find those answers almost always wrong. None of the answers actually fits with my experience of why I'm quitting this thing. I may still really like the person. It's not a commentary on them. I just don't want 2 of the things sent into my inbox, right? This is a great example of a time when they're getting really bad data, frankly, because my answer is I have a duplicate of this, but there's no room in there and I'm not going to type in that there was a duplicate, so I'm just getting rid of it. So I don't know if this is making sense to you, but like it's you get bad data if you don't know what the answers are, what the multiple selects should be. And so a lot of times I think just a little bit, even small amounts of having conversations with folks, or looking at where we've done interviews or where we've got information about what the examples are of why people why people unsubscribe. I unsubscribed because I get it on another platform, or I unsubscribe because I don't want to be there. So looking for like the qualitative things can then lead you to a more rich understanding of what the specific things are in your data that you'd be getting.
That's such a cool, thanks. That's such a tangible example of when of exactly how qual and quant can go together. That's really awesome.
It can go the other direction too, which is that you can have quantitative results and be like, why is this going on? What's going on with this thing? I need to go ask some folks about it, especially if it's human-centered data. There's a great example of this when I was doing the Carpentries workshop, one of my early ones at NYU. And they were talking about how they'd gotten this data back from all of these cabs in New York City. And they were creating models, and there was really cool, descriptions of how things moved and how does the flow go and all this kind of stuff, and network models and whatever. And then they realized that all of their models fell apart at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and they couldn't figure out why that was. Well, if you go talk to a cabbie, the cabbies are like, well, we know why, because everybody gets off shift at 4 o'clock and the shifts change. And so, the cabs are going in directions that you don't intend them to be going, because this was at that time, I don't know if this is still true. It's possible that things have changed, but I love that example of you have to go talk to some folks about why your data is the way it is. And it's okay to be asking those questions in situations where there's something that you see that's not quite right. And qualitative research is great for things like that. It's great for outliers, for instance. So a lot of times we create models by cutting off the outliers and being like, oh, we don't want to talk about those. But for qualitative research, we look for the outliers. We're interested in them. A lot of designers will they talk about designing for the margins. So if I'm trying to design something for, say, for instance, 18F, which is one of the design groups that tries to focus on government needs, if I'm trying to design for everybody, I want to start with those with disabilities because those folks are on the margins of what we design for. And so if I design for somebody who's hard of hearing, who's got visual issues, then I design for everybody. And so again, we might want to choose the outliers to be able to better understand our sample or our population or make it more accessible for more folks. And so I think that's another thing that I love about qualitative research. You could specifically you could do small groupings. You could do like, I will interview 3 people or do a survey where I'm trying to talk about people in the middle, or I'm trying to talk about people who are at the far ends of this. So.
I feel like I want to hear more of your examples. It's so neat to hear all about all these, but I wonder if we can maybe transition into what you did with us for Openscapes, and then maybe we'll hear more of those stories throughout. So with Openscapes, we worked with you to see whether QDA methods could be used in the Google Docs that we use in our cohort calls. So to give a little bit of background for folks, the Google Doc that we have going right now, we also use when we teach open data science practices and collaborative strategies for research teams, and particularly in environmental and earth science. So that was our existing data. Like Beth said, like these are documents that we have. We've worked with at this point 10 different cohorts of teams. So that's 10 different groups of documents with 60 different teams sort of sharing their work in here. And so we wanted to see whether QDA could help pull through some of the themes of the work that we do with these researchers. So can you describe, Beth, a little bit more about the process of what that looked like for you, and any more maybe background? Oh, sorry, Erin.
Just one more thing. So we had funding from the Moore Foundation for this project, and we were working with a cohort of their fundees, and there was a specific change that they were trying to affect. They wanted their funded projects to use protocols.io, and so in the cohort that we analyzed with Beth, we focused on that cohort. So it was that set of documents, and we were also looking at that transition. So one of the cool things about Openscapes that we've anecdotally observed is that this 2.5-month team-based cohort affects behavior change. And so that was really the thing that we were curious about with Beth, was one, is that happening really? And then I think the other, I want to kind of link back to Erica's comment in the chat, of thinking about qualitative data analysis and program evaluation. And so we also took the goals that we had from our proposal to Moore and included that in the kind of the framing of where we started with Beth. So, okay. So that's,
thanks, Erin.
Take it away, Beth.
Yeah, definitely. So I love all of this discussion too. So I had actually done this before with Data Carpentries a number of years ago, where they had some open, they basically wanted to code as well with the insights that were coming in from some of their open agendas. And I think, so I kind of knew it was possible to do, but it's also trying to figure out how does it work best for the group that you're working with. And we did a little bit of like figuring this out. And this is actually not uncommon for qualitative research to figure out like, what is it that we're looking for? What is our research question? And what is it that we're trying to find in the data that we have? And can we find the things we're looking for in the data that we have? And that's another part of this too, is that if you are using found data, you have to look at what the data has and what it doesn't have. So what we did is we started with the theory of change. And of course, what we found is that the theory of change that Openscapes has is fabulous, and it's also quite big. So it actually isn't going to be seeable in the small kind of parts of it were seeable, but not all of it's going to be seeable in there. So we ended up going with the more goals, which ended up being really helpful. We were looking to see, is there evidence for the different goals that that you had with the more foundation? And then because this work is inductive instead of deductive, so let me make sure I explain the distinction between those. So inductive research is, I know this field has something in it, and I'm going to take an educated guess about where to dig to find that thing. Where deductive is, I have a hypothesis and I'm testing it. So in other words, you're trying to say there's something here, but I'm trying to figure it out. And so as a result, we know what's going to come back isn't necessarily, we're going to be trying to use that information to dig a different hole or to go to another place. It's not unlike what anthropologists do or archaeologists do if they're trying to dig for, well, we're pretty sure that the wall would have been over here, so let's dig here. Oh, we found the wall, so let's go 10 feet that way to see if the wall is still there. You're doing something fairly similar. Or as I like to call it, doing biology on Mars, where you don't know any of the specific things that are there, right? You're trying to figure out, okay, this looks like what I would call a leaf, you know, so what does that mean and how can we create a typology of this? So essentially when you create a code book, you're creating what is essentially a typology or your biology textbook to try and explain, what is this leaf? Is it a grass? Is it a tree? Is it a bush? That kind of thing. So you are in some ways using your own sense of what you're looking for to try to find things. But what we do in this work also is we question ourselves. We say, okay, what do we think it is that we're going to get? And then we double check, what would we have gotten if you do counterfactuals. Essentially, you check to make sure, if I think I'm going to get this, what would I find if I was going to get this thing, and what would be evidence that I didn't have this? So you look through to make sure and double check the things that you did. So we did an exercise in the beginning. What do we think we're going to find in this data? What do we think we're going to see? And some of it we found and some of it we didn't. Which was kind of fun. It's pretty normal also. So we think we already have this sense of what's going to be there, and we find things that are surprising because we didn't look at it from these questions. So our research question for this was, how does Openscapes support teams to transition from closed research practices to open research practices? And that is a biased question in the sense that we're saying that Openscapes does do that, right? But that is also part of the goals that you have with more. So given that, it's appropriate for an evaluation context, which is that you're asking a question that you're trying to do. And then we found, we used the goals that we had from more, and we found some evidence for most of them, but we found some things that we weren't really expecting. So I mentioned time, for instance. We found a lot of folks talking about not having enough time. People were referring to discussions about time. And we started to realize that's a lens that people are viewing the work they're doing in Openscapes through. Can I do this in enough time? Do I have enough time to do this thing or to learn this thing? I'm setting aside time in these ways to be able to work with my group or my lab. This was another one which I just kept hearing the phrase or reading the phrase, writing things down. Yeah, we need to get things written down. We need to know where things are written down. We need to keep track of these things. And so that language of where is the information, where is the data being stored, and that is in addition to data storage. So sometimes it was about protocols, but sometimes it was just about, like, I just needed to know how I did this the last time and how I'm going to move the data, how I'm going to store it, who needs to know what. That was also connected quite well to onboarding and offboarding, which was another discussion topic that hadn't been something we brought up, but folks were talking about, how do we bring people onto the teams, giving them the protocols, giving them the information, getting them to write things down in the right place so that the information could be retained by the lab. And then offboarding, when they leave, if they have a bunch of information in their heads, how do we get that information out of them so we don't lose things? And I think the understanding that labs are often quite a flow of people coming in and out is part of the impetus for something like Openscapes as a program, because what it does is it creates an environment for them to have discussions, to set aside the time to be able to have these ongoing discussions around how to do open science in a way that's useful for the team. And sometimes open science is just as simple as, like, where did you write that down? Like, where is that thing that I need? Where is that information that I was looking for? So that's kind of my perspective, but I would love to hear from you two, if I can turn the tables, how this was for you. We did a sort of like doing it together. We had some fits and starts. What was it like to do qualitative research for the first time?
Well, before we answer that, one thing I just want to say about sort of the process was, when Julia and I are in the cohort process, there's a lot of things that, like, we can sort of sense, like we're hearing them, but we're not making sense of them. And I think so it was cool when you looked at all of the documents and then started pulling all of those time comments together, and we could see them in one place, and we could say like, this is the theme that's emerging. So it was really, I think that was, I don't know how to explain that to people who are thinking about doing this for their projects, but for me, it was just so cool to have that organized structure.
It's one of my favorite things to do, because essentially what I get to do is like pull out pieces that people have said and articulate them in a grouping and in a way that maybe can be heard in a different sense. So the whole point of qual research is that I'm never inventing anything. Anything that exists in the data is something that I would present. You obviously can't present everything, so that's part of the challenge, but I take in a lot of information, and what we try to do is organize it in a way that can be given back and be heard and understood. And that's where the rigor comes from in qualitative research. So rigor in more kind of conventional STEM fields or in quantitative work is that I'm reproducible, that this is something that we know the steps, we can do it again. We don't have that luxury. Like the one cohort went, there's no counterfactual to the cohort, right? Those people had that experience. We can't find another one. We can't find another sample of those exact same people. Every once in a while, there are natural, examples that are really fun where you can be like, oh, we could actually compare these two. But most of the time in the human world, we don't have reproducibility. That's just not possible. And so given that, what can we do that's of use? And how do we make sure and maintain our rigor? And one of the key ways to do that is that I don't if something contradicts a statement that I'm making as a theme, I have to include it. So as an ethical researcher, if you have a contradiction in your data, you have to share it. So I've heard talks before from qualitative researchers where they're like, everybody in this survey, or everybody in our study said this except for this one outlier. And you have to explain the outlier, because otherwise you're not representing the sample very well. So everybody agreed with this thing, but this one person said this other thing. And this case is interesting because, or maybe not interesting, in some other settings. So we can't throw data out. That's the fun.
To your question on how the experience was for us, I learned so much. I came into this, I'd seen your slides from the CSV conf a few years before, and was a little bit, that was all I knew, but that had been so transformative for me. I put a screenshot in the doc. But to actually do that with you, to screen share with you in Taget, and see you highlighting pieces of text in the agenda doc and say like, this is the theme of time, and to like make the tag or code of time and highlight that and then continue on. And that was just so interesting to see that process and how iterative it was. And then also like this thing, I think that is still, there's so much to learn in this space. I'm still like, just kind of like on the edges, like in awe of this whole process. But I think the metadata that is essentially the field notes, right? Like when you and I look at the same text and you're coding it, and then I remember who said that, or like that, and that's the metadata that's not written down yet, and how to like how and when to incorporate that, I think is like so fascinating. And how far do you go? Because we've talked about like you could interview, or look at the transcripts instead of the text, which is a subset of what actually was said in those calls and stuff. So that's, again, it's kind of like that. I don't know, just the whole process was so interesting. And then also just like seeing that you could always learn more and do more. And that's really exciting as well. But that was just some idea.
So it's fun that you bring that up, because so we were using things that we had, but you're right, you have more information in your head that is actually data. I would call it data, but it's not data in my world because we didn't write it down. So since you know who it was and you know what the conversation was, you know, maybe that you typed in those notes or whatever it was that was in the agenda, you have more context for me, but I can't use that context because I wasn't there and I didn't write it down. So this is one of the things that happens for ethnographic researchers who go into fields. So for example, I did that work when I was doing an organizational ethnography of the US Green Building Council. So I went in and I was a part of meetings, and essentially my job was to write field notes. So-and-so said such and such a thing to respond to this other thing. And so I began to write all of those pieces where this person said that thing, this tension was happening in this thing. There was a slight issue about numbers in this conversation. This soils person didn't agree with this other soils person. You know, there's like discussions around what the science conversations were. And I was trying to understand those pieces as they lead to, say, creating a standard. And you know, but that has to be data. So in order for it to be data, you have to have a person who takes that data and writes it down. Again, much like you would do it in the field if you were Jane Goodall looking at chimpanzees, right? She writes field notes about what it is that happens, and she gets to know them really well. And that information and knowledge that she has in the past feeds into why I think certain behaviors are being seen or not. But without that information, what's kind of interesting is that you can still find stuff, right? So I could go back through, say, Margaret Mead's notebooks and maybe still find information that she might not have looked at because she was looking at it from a slightly different perspective. So in qualitative research, and especially in anthropology, it's a bit fetishized, but your notebooks become kind of the thing that you bring back to you. And those notebooks are the things that are your data that you can use to do more analysis later. And I like to think about it in terms of what questions are you asking the data as well. So what am I asking this? If I was asking the question of gender differences, I wouldn't be able to look at that in these agendas because there isn't any data or information on that, right? We didn't specify gender when folks were typing in there. I can't do an analysis in that way. But maybe Julie and Erin could have, if they had sat there and taken notes through it to say, oh, you know, a certain amount more time is spoken by men versus women in this situation, right? So you also have to look at like what kinds of answers can I actually find in the data that I have, and are there pieces of data, are there observations that I need to add to this that might help understand that better?
Yeah, and I think for me, I mean, the process was really interesting, like Julie said. I think that what I really appreciated about it was the iterative nature of it, and that the three of us could kind of be there in that messiness and that tension of like, okay, we're realizing that time is emerging as a theme, but what that means is that you have to go back through the past set of notes to find time in those notes that have already been tagged. So just this like iterative process. And also, I mean, I really appreciated the skill that you had, Beth, of being able to make this such a painless process for us.
I'm so glad.
and also, I mean, I think there's this nice separation too of you weren't there, and so then having you take this objective outside perspective, as we've reflected these things back to more and to ourselves, I think it's just been really useful that like they did, we wondered like, would things emerge from the node stacks, and they did. And we could always do more, but we don't have to.
Right.
And maybe Julie and I will talk about like how we're taking it forward, but I do see a question in the chat, which I think we want to come back to, but one thing I want to say is like, we're not just counting tags, but so it's not just that we had like 15 things that we tagged as time, but it's what the text of those things were.
And I wonder if that would be a good time, like how QDA relates to storytelling and just the stories that comes out. Cause I think you're right. Like, it's not just about counting the number of times the tags comes up, but it's pulling that narrative. And then we could talk, because there's also a question in the notes about how this has influenced Openscapes going forward. So we can come back to that.
So I'll definitely address first the quantitative discussion of qualitative research. It's fine, do it. I mean, if you want to, it's fine. That said, what is it actually telling you? Any good data or any analysis of data that you would do in a quantitative setting, what information is it giving you? And quite often, the information that it's giving you is not all that helpful. So that people have used, have talked about time 20 times versus 30 times doesn't necessarily tell you that time matters more to them or less than them. It's possible that you could have asked a question, and I think you did ask questions like, what are the challenges that you're facing right now? And folks answered time in there. And so if I tell you that people are referring to time, but they're also talking about time in relationship to developing protocols, that gives you different information about what time is and what it matters, how it matters to them. And when I reflect back quotes and I give you some quotes that give you, oh, when you're talking about time, you're meaning it in this particular way. Another good example is that sometimes there are things, qualitative research will often pick up things that you're not sure that are kind of there, but nobody wants to talk about it. So time is a good example of that. Power is another one. So we know there's a power relationship difference. And so there's something going on there, but I just don't know how to talk about it. And so the researcher themselves may be iterating or iterating to try to figure out what that thing is. And it may not be until the very end that they go, oh, it's about this topic. And I didn't ask any research questions. I didn't ask any interview questions about that topic because I didn't know. Like, how could I ask them about time when I was at the beginning of this research things? I didn't know that was one of the conclusions I was going to come to. And so I didn't ask anybody about those research questions, but it was finally dawned on me, oh, the thing they've been talking about all this time has been this other thing. And so especially if you're working, again, anthropologists who are working in a language that's not their native tongue, you can often miss words. Or say I'm working with a bunch of folks from NASA and I don't understand what they mean when they use this word, but I learn it. And by the time I'm done, I go, oh, you've been talking about that since the beginning, but I haven't been taking notes on that topic because I didn't understand you. Or I took notes, but I didn't know what they meant. And so just giving the number of times that was in my field notes is going to be a misrepresentation of the information and the finding that I have and the theme that has been created. So that said, I mean, that's what I mean by iterative research and inductive research, is that the inductive research means that the findings may not actually, like, now I could say, once I've figured out that this is a topic, now we can do quantitative work where we could focus on that. But before that, I was still exploring to figure out what that thing is that I'm trying to understand. The other question you asked was about stories. I love talking about stories. So stories are a form of data. Stories are a form, like, what stories do we tell each other as we're getting started doing lab work together? What are the stories that we tell about why we do our work together? What motivates the things that we do? What are the stories that come out of our lab? What are the things that we do to talk about our camaraderie and our connection to one another? What are the stories that kind of evolve and keep going? I'll give you an example from my green building research that I love. This was one of my favorite things, is that I kept hearing folks talk about a guy named Ray Anderson, who's an amazing guy. He was one of the founders of Interface Carpets. And I ended up going and looking up his story, but essentially he decided that he wanted to change this carpet manufacturer into something where every carpet could be returned to them and reused and in some manner, to the point where he ended up creating like these slate tiles that could be used for roofing, which is not something that you would think a carpet manufacturer would get into, but he was just so passionate about the idea that anything that came back, any part of a carpet, he would be willing to figure out a new use for. And that's the kind of thing where, because that story kept being told over and over again in my research, I had to investigate, what does this story mean to people? They meant that you could do this. I mean, it was an incredibly successful business. And so that was part of it. It's like, good business is also sustainable. So that story helped make folks feel like there was a claim towards business and sustainability didn't have to be separated. They could be hand in hand. And that was really important for the field of green building. And it was one of the things that really, and you wouldn't think like a carpet manufacturer is like somebody that, I don't know, an architect is telling me stories about. But he was, right? A contractor was telling me this, so you get all these different folks that are all talking about the same story. What does the story mean to them? And how does it talk about a specific kind of thing in their field? So I think it's worth investigating those kinds of things, as we're also trying to understand leadership, as we're trying to understand how do we share open science? What are the stories we use to try and convey open science? Are we capturing the stories? Are we sharing the stories? Are the stories portable? Can they be told by somebody else? Like, could Erin tell my story about, interface carpeting so that they can move on to another person to be able to explain things? I have actually no idea, so maybe that's not a great example. But what are the stories you can tell that might move things along? Erin, you had something here.
Yeah, well, I just think that's such a great one, a great point about stories being data, but two, thinking about the stories that we tell. Often we kick off Openscapes Champions cohorts with better science in less time, and thinking about future us. And Julie talks about her experience. I've talked about my experience, and telling these stories about how we've had these transformative shifts in our career towards more open science. We've brought other people in that tell those same stories. And I hadn't been thinking about those as data, or thinking about the way that they kind of travel around either, which is just really a neat idea. And I'm curious from the group too about other, the stories that you tell around open science too.
Yeah, I love that. I like Stephanie's comment too, that the carpet story indicates a kind of community aspiration amongst the group. Absolutely. So another way to think of it is in terms of the culture building can also involve who are your heroes. You could also argue that Ray Anderson would be a hero. We tell a story about my relationship to Ray Anderson, for instance. So who are the heroes? Who are we uplifting? What are we talking about in those fields? Who are the folks that we turn to give us inspiration? And then, who are the villains, right? Who are the ones that we're thinking of as being problems, or maybe they're not people, but they're also other parts. But those can also help create culture too. So as we uplift people and we say, oh my gosh, Openscapes is amazing, they're doing all this cool work, we get to tell stories for other people in a way that, and that's, I think, also dovetails with kindness. Kinder science means I get to be like, this other lab created this amazing thing that's going to be so useful. Let's share that information. Can I tell this story in such a way that I grow open science? I become a champion of open science because I'm excited that somebody else had a success. Alan Alda Institute. So I did the AAAS fellowship for the, which is American Association for the Advancement of Science. I was at the Department of Energy, but we got a lot of good stuff on science communication. And the Alan Alda's group really focuses on how do you encourage scientists to tell their stories? Why do you care about what you're doing, right? I don't understand the details of your scientific work, but I can care and I can hear the passion about something that matters to you. And maybe there's a reason why you study ocean ecology, for instance. Maybe you have a real passion for the ocean. And I know that as scientists, we're often told to separate that part of ourselves, but that's the thing that gets other folks excited. That's the thing that helps people care about what our work is. I think it's so powerful to be able to both share your own story and then also to point to other stories that are meaningful to you too. So.
Getting some +1s and yeses in the chat. Maybe we should turn to a few audience questions, just looking at the fact that the hour is flying by.
Oh my gosh. Sure thing.
Julie, is there one that you want to start with, or do we want to open it up to verbal Q&A? You are muted.
Just thinking about where Openscapes is going to go with this work with Beth. And I think one thing we're really interested about is equipping other people to be able to lead Openscapes cohorts. And so, we've been working with developing more mentors, but also thinking about the architecture for making this work. So Beth's code book that is a starting point for people to use if they want to evaluate the cohorts they're using, and thinking about how we've also been creating an R package to help kind of automate the infrastructure for cohorts, and how the code book could be part of that, like, GitHub repository that we start off with and whatnot. So I think that's one part of continuing to do qualitative data analysis with Openscapes cohorts to compare progress within a cohort, but then also across cohorts as other folks are leading these. And I think, that's the idea. We'll see kind of how it's going to be messy and and whatnot. But I think that this sort of experiment proof of concept, I think, has been really exciting. Yeah, what would you add, Erin?
Yeah, so just a little bit. So we're thinking about our process. So following on the major project that we did with Beth, where Beth did all of the tagging, we're taking that code book and then applying it to our NASA cohort as part of this work that Julie was just describing of how do we then help others and grow Openscapes and run their own champions programs. So we're testing this out. And so Beth was mentioning one that it can't be data if it's not written down. So Julie and I take just a few minutes after each call and do a quick core dump of observations and things that we noted in the call. And then we come back to, and we also do a quick tagging of the agenda doc. So we're trying that to see how it goes. But like Julie said, messy and iterative.
I'll just say that I love that you took that advice, because I think it's the kind of thing that you can do. And when I do it well, after a conversation with somebody, even if it's just an informal one, writing down a couple of notes for yourself about what it was that you got out of something.
Oops.
This worked, this didn't work, teaching this thing felt a little clunky today, but teaching this other thing went really well. That can also be really helpful.
So I think we're losing people and they're dropping off.
Yes.
There are, looks like we lost Julie.
Oh no. Oh dear.
I want to, for people who can hang on, and Taya, I want to come back to your question about efforts to equip Black people to this platform, especially for new data analysts. And I wonder if if it's around the qualitative data analysis that you're wondering about, or around the Openscapes work, or both.
Erin, I am just asking about both as a new data analysis and just trying to navigate the waters and learn, and being new to R and just new to everything. I find that majority of the time I'm the only Black person in the room, and I find that people are talking over my head, and I don't see, and a lot of links are shot out in the chat, but where is opportunities to, I don't know, just be a little more patient and open and forthcoming with the information, like, to and yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Julie, you want to take it first?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. We've been working with Ileana Fenwick, who is a Black marine ecologist, and she's particularly been interested in how Openscapes could be more welcoming to the Black community. And is developing a pathways to Openscapes idea that would be community calls like this, led by her for the Black community, with support from us who can be there to answer questions. She's really thinking about how important open science is, particularly for the community she's already a part of, but how the entryways that we've been thinking about as welcoming are still not early enough. So that's one example of what we're trying to learn from. But I don't know, I'd love to talk to you more about it, because we're trying to learn how to support in this space more. So thank you.
I'll also just shout out to Carrie Jordan at the Carpentries and a lot of their work as well. They're quite connected to
thank you,
particularly Black. She's from Black engineering groups as well. I know she's done quite a lot of work, and I think they have I want to say there was a grant. I'm not going to say it because I'm not sure for sure, but I think there was a grant that they were working on to work for HBCUs to try and include more carpentries workshops there. So
Absolutely.
Thanks.
there we go.
Thanks.
I also think it's really, oops, sorry, I'll just kind of say with that, like, I also think it's really important to have folks who are researchers from different communities as well. And that's one of the things I love about qualitative research, is that it can really be done by anyone if they get the training in it. So can we train folks? Can we learn from communities? Can we have different, researchers from different backgrounds? And I mean that in the broadest sense. I also mean it internationally. I mean it from age differences, power differences, so folks who are PIs who are not. Like, can we start to have discussions that are more open about the many queer folks in science communities? I think it's really good to empower folks to bring data and multiple forms of data that can ask good questions. So
Absolutely.
Well, I wonder if we should switch into closing. Okay, so Beth in the notes here has, I'll just say out loud, your free intro qualitative workshop soon,
yes.
which is awesome. Highly recommend. Yeah, do you have any last things you'd like to share, Beth?
No, I love this topic. I just really love getting to chat with you both. And I'm super passionate about this and excited about sharing anything. So please sign up for my mailing list if you're interested in workshops upcoming. I try to do free stuff because I really like to just talk to anybody. So feel free to come to things. And then also I'm so grateful for what Openscapes does and for all of the work that you're putting out into the world. And thanks for everybody who's on this call and who listens to it later. Thank you so much for this.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Beth.
Take care, everyone. Good to see folks.
Yeah. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, thanks so much.